Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for over 20 years. I'm a biblical studies student, Bible teacher. If you want to read my writings, they're on samburke.org. My training involves biblical studies, theology, biblical languages, all that kind of stuff. I want to talk about gospel formation today. We usually do Theology Thursdays. And we've been talking about text criticism. Today I want to talk about source criticism as it relates to the New Testament Gospels. Now, we're not going to talk about it from a traditional perspective. So if you're someone who's like, I only adhere to traditional ways of viewing this, that these four gospel writers were eyewitnesses of Jesus or connected to eyewitnesses of Jesus, and we're not really interested in the academic study of what's going on here with these and what the academic side of it has discovered, then this probably isn't the video for you, and you probably, just click on to the next one, okay? We're going to talk about source criticism. We're going to talk about what we actually are seeing in the development of the Gospels. And so there's a couple different ways to look at it. Even conservative scholars have a view of source criticism that shows up in one of two or three arenas. What used to be the majority view is called Matthean priority, or Matthew's priority, and having Matthew go first. It looks something like this on this. I have a bunch of charts here. So on the left-hand side here, it's Matthew, and then from there you see Mark and Luke, and Mark uses Matthew, and Luke uses Matthew, and then Mark kind of pulls from Luke, and they would say Mark maybe was later, and that was how it went. For a while, that was the way scholars looked at it. And that has completely changed, and it hasn't changed recently. It's been a long time that scholars have decided, hey, we don't think it's Matthew first. It's actually, we think Mark was written first. And so they would date Mark around anywhere between like 68 to 71 CE, around that time frame, and Mark was first. In fact, I think before Mark though, even there was another gospel they call the Lost Gospel. Some people call this Q. This is the source that they would have pulled a bunch of stuff for, but Mark would have written not based on Q. That's not the way that I think they would look at it. It would look more like this chart here. That Mark wrote first. He maybe had some kind of sources that he was using. He was hearing, oral stories passed down. He maybe had a few things written down, but he wrote his gospel first. And then Matthew and Luke would take Mark and would write their gospels based upon what they were reading in Mark. And so that's why you find a lot of what Mark writes in Matthew and Luke almost verbatim. This is what's called the synoptic problem, talking about these three synoptic gospels. But there's also stuff that's not in Mark that all of a sudden appears in Matthew and Luke. And so that's where Q comes in. And they would have pulled this, this information from this Q, this lost gospel, where it has a bunch of different sayings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, maybe some of the miracles that weren't in Mark. That's where Matthew and Luke would have gotten their extra information from. And then that's a theory too. Well, lately, there's also been another theory. And the other theory is that Mark, yes, does go first, but Matthew takes Mark and uses Mark. And then ultimately, Luke goes last and takes what Matthew has written and uses Matthew as Luke's source, plus some extra information. And I think, to be honest, that's probably more likely. I think what we see with, and what I would posit, now I'm not going to say I have my theory is that what we see is that Mark's early. And the reason we say he's early is because his is the least developed version of the gospel. It's like what we see in Mark, moving then to Matthew, moving then to Luke, is a development of the tradition, a development of these gospels from Mark and his very rough writing about how he sees things, doesn't understand the geography of the area, or he just doesn't care, moving them fast, like quickly all over the place. He says he's going to go one way, it goes the other way, kind of a deal. And then you have Matthew kind of correcting a lot of this stuff in his gospel and going, there's Greek grammar involved that Matthew just seems to kind of clear up and smooths out the rough edges of Mark. And then Luke comes along, and Luke takes the same kind of stories and then does even more massaging and more smoothing out of these rough edges. And so instead of like, when I was growing up, they told me it was this, it's like, well, if you see a pen from 4 different vantage points, you're going to see different things, right? So somebody on this side is going to see what it looks like over here, but they're going to see what it looks like over here. And from this point, it looks like this. I don't think that's what we're seeing here. I think what we see in the Gospels is someone made a pen, then they passed it on to the next person. The other person sees that pen, but they look at what that pen is and like, I can make it I've heard it differently. Or I have another source that actually can help correct some of this stuff that was on this pen that it was kind of rough at the beginning, but we can make it better. And we can really like tell the actual thing. And then the third person comes along and goes, well, I have this pen, the original pen, and this pen, and now I've got other sources that I can also use. We can fill this out and make this even better. And I think that's what you see with the Gospels. I think you see the story developing in a better way, almost like, it's in Mark, it's kind of roughly worked out. Matthew's worked out a little more, but with a little different purpose. And then Luke comes along and says, I'm going to take all this information and I'm going to synthesize it down. And we're going to talk about what really happened in the gospel based on all this evidence, based on all this other stuff, based upon what the tradition of the story has been and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's probably more likely is what we see, is we see Mark go first in writing his gospel, Matthew taking Mark, using it as his source, having another extra source that he's pulling from. And I would even posit, so one of the early church fathers says that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, Matthew, wrote a sayings gospel. And I would posit that maybe what Matthew wrote is this sayings gospel, that whoever pulled all of the, like Mark and then the sayings gospel and other things together and edited it, I think they're the ones who get credit for now it's just kind of being called Matthew. But they're using Matthew's actual, sayings gospel plus Mark's gospel pulled together to be like, this is it. And it gets called Matthew. And then, Luke comes along later, the author of Luke comes along later, takes Matthew and uses that heavily as his source, knowing that Mark was before, but he's like, I'm going to use the corrected source here. And then he's probably got access to other information as well, pulling that in, other traditions, other people talking about this, pulling all of this information together. And then we have Luke's gospel. And so I think that's more likely of what's going on here. There's also quite a few Bible scholars who are putting this thing forth, and they're saying there's no need for this idea of Q, even that Mark went first, then Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew, and then some extra sources. But this lost gospel isn't out there. Guys like Mark Goodacre, Austin Farrer, Michael Golder, they would argue that there's no need for Q. This is how this all worked. And you can look into that. There's books that they've written on this kind of stuff. The more I get into it, the more I study it, I think what we're seeing is Matthew using Mark, and plus some kind of sayings thing where we get all the parables, the teachings, the long discourses, some more of the miracles, the ending with the resurrection and the tomb, the Great Commission, all that, it's all in there. And then Luke comes along and Luke takes Matthew, Luke takes some other sources, pulls it all together and rounds out the gospel and completes it. And so what we see is a trajectory of growth in the tradition, not 4 separate ones from 4 different vantage points. So what are you going to see with that? You're going to see inconsistencies, or you're going to see corrections, or you're going to see contrasts between them. And the reason for the contrast isn't because these are 4 different people contrasting and contradicting each other. It's they're actually correcting each other and trying to move it towards something that is more accurate versus something that was early on that was kind of like thrown together kind of a deal. So that's kind of the way I'm seeing it, and what I think it could be an interesting theory and hypothesis for this. And I think we're seeing in scholarship some people moving towards that idea as well. So kind of a cool thing. Like I said, if you're not into this kind of stuff and you're like, no, it's tradition, these are 4 eyewitnesses or whatever, that's totally fine. That's up to you. That's not really what the data points out, but you can believe that, I guess. But I'm really interested in the gospel formation and how all that worked, and from a scholarly point of view. And so that's the point of this video. All right. Hopefully that was informational for you. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.